Future Design Podcast.
This is Takatoshi Shibayama, and you're listening to the Future Design Podcast. Today I've got Pieter Fourie, Senior Researcher from the Future Cities Laboratory. We're going to have a chat about autonomous vehicles, flying taxis, and a possible Orwellian society.
So, Peter, so what is your vision of the future in transportation?
Well, I hope it is not that dystopia that you're talking about, where it's a bit like Wall-E. You know, everybody's sitting on a couch, and
Oh yeah, that's
an automated couch that just gets you from one meal to the next. So hopefully we'll still have something that resembles a community where we can get around pretty easily and equitably. Everybody has access to mobility,
and we could still walk.
and importantly, where it's maybe a future where technology is set up in such a way that it kind of encourages you to have that active
Right.
mobility as well. Yeah.
Remember in Back to the Future, I think it was the third one, when Marty goes back into time, it was it was Doc that was talking about, in the future, people actually walk or something like that, and then everybody was laughing at him,
Exactly.
saying, or something like that, right? You run for fun or something like that.
Yeah, it's funny. Now, a more recent sort of reference was I actually saw it the other day in Stranger Things, and this idea of somebody just walking by the side of the road is so alien.
Yeah.
And especially in that day, in like the 1980s,
Yeah.
the car was the ultimate form of transportation.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting to see how that's changing.
Yeah.
It's people kind of want that back. They want
Yeah.
that the ability to to have more of a sort of a human scale interaction with the world.
Yeah.
I would say.
I think everything is becoming a lot more tech these days, and maybe there is a future where people want to like scale that back a little bit, and then be more, humane, I guess, in that sense, like less tech. I don't know. Like I think about my kids, going through their iPads and and watching YouTube, and they're so the information is like right in their face. I mean, our generation is like having a tough time, getting ourselves off the smartphone, and interact with other people. But maybe kids in the future, maybe one or two generations later, can actually manage that much better than us.
Yeah, or we certainly don't want them to sit like in a self-driving car and something like a Minority Report and just get bombarded with advertising that's completely catered to exploit their every vulnerability because
I would hate that. I'll be like, fuck that. Yeah,
exactly.
You don't want to see all ads in your eyes.
Yeah, so and it's going to be hard to design cities like that. I think because definitely the capitalist incentive is to have exactly that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, look at Facebook, look at Cambridge Analytica, look at all the machine learning algorithms and things nowadays. It's nothing. There's no better captive audience than when you're sat in a vehicle, and they know exactly who you are, where you're coming from, where you're going to, and maybe cross-reference that a bit against your spinning patterns. Know that if you're picking a guy up at 12 o'clock in Geylang, this guy's maybe ready to make some bad decisions. Imagine the car decides where you're going to go next, right?
Right. Ads of condoms coming up. Use this one.
Imagine, yeah. So there are all sorts of ways to imagine that future. And certainly, I totally agree with you. I mean, I've got a kid now myself, and that definitely changes your perspective on how you see all of this panning out in the end. So, I mean, we're definitely trying to think in a more proactive way. How are you going to design to get those outcomes?
Yeah.
Rather than just ending up with a world that's kind of more designed for machines than for humans, which is kind of what we have at the moment.
Yeah. Right. So in the future of transportation, so we're talking about autonomous cars, flying taxis, hyperloop kind of things. What are we what are we designing at the moment?
Yeah, but maybe that's the first thing we should talk about is it really gonna be all of that?
Yeah.
I mean, if I look at my, some of the researchers that I'm following on LinkedIn, especially the Dutch guys, they say, why are you bothering with all of this nonsense? You've already got human scale transportation, that can get you to most places in a pretty reasonable time without too much fuss. You get on a bicycle and it's still actually the most efficient way of getting around. So I really hope that that's still kind of part of the future. And I think you see it in the planning that they're doing here in Singapore as well. Like if you get into the elevators at the Urban Redevelopment Authority, they have lots of sort of provocative, posters sometimes set up in the elevators. It's nice conversation items. And one of them was looking at the share of like bus trips. It's less than 1 kilometer.
Right.
And then you see there's a hell of a lot of them.
Okay. Well, people here don't really like to walk outside.
Exactly, right? But maybe if you've got electric bicycles and if there's actual infrastructure, then all of those areas where we see those trips, you could get the people out of the bus, right?
Yeah.
So you could get the people maybe out of the car if they're going to make that trip. So I really are just getting back to what we said before. That's going to be part of the future vision. But of course, you can't get everywhere by bicycle, and so I would say that the kind of thinking that we're doing at the moment is, obviously things like the self-driving cars are featuring quite strongly, but there's also there's also a lot there, that we should unpack maybe as we go on later, because there's a lot you can do with that technology. And there are lots of good and bad decisions that you can probably make in terms of just how you're gonna use that system. And hopefully we don't see too much in the way of of air taxis, except for cases where it really makes sense. Singapore, we tend to be, it's a contained city, no?
Yeah.
There's no place that you can expand into. But most places in the world, where I come from, Johannesburg and Pretoria, they've sprawled to the extent that they've essentially kind of meshed into each other.
Right.
And it's just continuing.
Yeah.
And that's the case in most cities in the
true.
world, because it's all enabled by, the ability to move very far, very cheaply. And the costs of that is besides the environmental cost of all of the natural environment that you're destroying in the process, there's also all sorts of social costs, that you're paying, and obviously just a much larger network that you need to upkeep. The moment we've got flying cars, then we can basically infect any part of the world, right?
Right, exactly.
So that's kind of
Yeah.
So I'm still a bit conservative as far as that's concerned, but I certainly see that there's potential for it as a substitute for for high-speed rail in certain countries that maybe can't afford that sort of infrastructure.
Right. I guess also it's political, right? So, we were discussing a little bit before, if you want to have a high-speed train that goes through different countries, there's a lot of political issues. Political regimes change while the build-out is happening. I could just see so many, barriers to
Certainly,
making that happen.
And at least from an aerospace point of view, those sort of relationships are already pretty established. Although I can't see these vehicles sharing the same airspace, so there'll have to be special corridors for them, and there'll definitely be very specific challenges, especially for the fact that you can't queue in the air, right? Or not, at least not cheaply. I usually feel a little bit uneasy after a long haul flight if all of a sudden I'm put in a holding pattern in the plane.
Right.
I imagine you're in an electric flying car and you can see the battery level steadily dropping. As you're waiting.
And you don't want to be on the bottom either, on the ground.
Exactly. So there's that. But yeah, certainly for the for certain contexts where it's hard to get high-speed rail, like in the US, we see now the mess that they have in California with all of the lawsuits just piling up because people own the property where you have to build this infrastructure. So I can see it having potential in those sort of contexts. I think it can be amazing to activate a region like what we see here, the archipelago of Indonesia and Malaysia, where at the moment they have to rely on things like ferries, right?
Yeah.
And so everything is massively staggered. You can imagine that being able to have a very fast, relatively high volume connection between such islands can lead to massive economic empowerment. But at the same time, like our ability to infect most of the world is also increasing because we're becoming less and less reliant on connective infrastructure. So I can see that being a concern. Now we can go to habitats that have been untouched, and you can just purify your own water. You can set up your own solar panels and whatever. And you can have your little life out there in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
And I can see that becoming problematic. So yeah, I'm still very concerned. I think and obviously I'm sure that the powers that be that have to decide about whether these things go ahead, they're probably just as concerned. At least I hope they are, in terms of really deciding how this technology should play out in the end.
Right. Well, let's talk about the autonomous cars now. Then, because Singapore has been experimenting with autonomous cars. So I've heard. And what are they doing with these cars? What are the results that they're getting? Is this something that we can see rolling out in like 5 years or so?
So yeah, you're right. There's a lot of work going on in that. One of the major spin-off companies of MIT was actually based in Singapore. They come from the Singapore MIT Alliance for Research and Technology, which conveniently shortens to SMART. Okay. It's Frazzoli's company, and him and his colleagues. It's called Newtonomy.
Yeah.
And they do a lot of the really the AI and computational infrastructure that you need to make this stuff work. So there's a lot of tech being developed. ST Engineering, in Singapore is doing a lot. They've already got concepts for for autonomous buses and things like that. There's the CTRAN, NTU, and I can't remember who they're collaborating with there. But there's this whole testing center on the western part of the island,
right,
where they're testing all of these different autonomous vehicle concepts from a lot of different companies,
right,
in a simulated urban environment. And they've got a rain simulator there to see if the thing doesn't run people over at the moment.
Right, yeah.
The moment there's a bit of a storm, or does it still work when it's in a really like sort of a urban canyon environment versus when it's open road?
Yeah.
So that's quite interesting. So yeah, a lot of work going on in the technology side, but also a lot of forward thinking, I think, on the planning side. We are working with SMART and the National University of Singapore, together with all of the major agencies, in a project commissioned by the Ministry of Transport and the Ministry of National Development, where we really try to design new neighborhoods to deal with this mode and actually start to think about how is this actually going to play out. Once this technology has reached a certain level of maturity where it's really viable.
Right.
And how does that kind of fit with the, with the vision that they have in Singapore for this? You must have heard of it, this car light Singapore.
Yeah, sure.
So Singapore has always been leading in terms of, its philosophy about motorized transport. So there's this, currently we have this certificate of entitlement, which is, I guess for people that don't live in Singapore, it's an upfront cost that you pay just for the right to own a car.
Yep.
And then there are just massive taxes and so on that help to limit the population of vehicles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the COE costs as much as the car, or the original cost of the car, and then here it's taxed like 3 or 4 times the actual value of the car. So it makes it really difficult for people to buy a car. However, I see so many people owning a car, so it almost seems like it's not actually working.
Well, I mean, that's a whole kettle of that's a can of worms on its own there, because obviously those sort of policies also interact with financing policies. And I understand also that those finance policies have now again been adjusted, because if you can pay off that certificate of entitlement over a 10-year period, then you can actually bring the cost down quite significantly. And there are certainly certain user groups that are willing to pay that, because you can think of it. I mean, I know myself. I've got a kid. It can be hard sometimes. If you want to go somewhere and you always have to carry everything with you. It's nice. The car is almost like a movable storage system.
Yeah.
Right? and for that, but I mean, I drive sometimes, but I make use of Car Club, which is like this car sharing company, and there are more and more of those initiatives going on there as well. But to get back to the earlier question, so they've been pretty proactive in terms of managing the car population, and then there's electronic road pricing to also manage the use of the vehicle. But ultimately, they want to go car line, which means that they can actively reduce the car population, because the cars are not only problematic in all of the ways that we know, which is greenhouse gases. I mean, you can say, okay, then let's just make all of them electrical, but they just take up a lot of space. The amount of road space is something like 14 or 16%. I'm speaking, under correction here, but of the buildable surface of what's already a very a land scarce country. And I mean, to the extent that they actually have to consider building underground, right? So if you can reclaim all of that space for other purposes, then that's really great. And if you can green the environment in the process, you can really reduce this urban heat island effect, that they're suffering from, where the island is essentially much warmer than what it would have been if it was not built up in the way that it is.
Right. I always thought that cars in the future will be like public transport. It's like buses, where you have a scheduled time. Well, maybe not scheduled time, but there's a finite limit of buses that are out in the city, and maybe you hail a car and you get in it and go to a certain destination, but you don't own a car, right? It's like you don't own a bus, right? Same thing.
So that's exactly, you're exactly right. That's kind of the vision that they have for these self-driving cars, that you don't end up with a completely a private ownership model. Of course, you're still going to have, again, some user groups that are simply either married to the concept of having a car. I mean, there are also lots of cultural issues in the sense of a car being a really powerful status symbol in a country where everybody knows exactly how much it costs. So it's a great way for you to advertise your resources. But that aside, that will likely become a much smaller group, and maybe through some advocacy. I mean, at least we know also that this is a country that's open to to new initiatives like that. So maybe we'll see some adjustment of the population, and we'll see that radically reduced. And then the self-driving car becomes exciting, because it allows you a mix of public transportation that you can't operate at this stage, because it's simply the cost of paying all of those drivers would be too prohibitive. And of course, there are the other benefits of these systems in the sense that they can drive in a really coordinated way.
Yeah.
You can stack a lot of them much closer to each other, and they've got the control systems that are much better than human beings. So you can effectively, double the capacity of your available infrastructure, or conversely, you can cut out half of the existing infrastructure and use it for something else.
Yeah.
Right. And the main thing is how do you fill them up? There's a bit of resistance getting into a smaller vehicle with a bunch of strangers.
Right.
Is not always, not people might not be so keen on that. So those are some of the things that we're looking at. How should they operate? Maybe I don't want to get in the car with a bunch of strangers, but if I can book the ride beforehand, for my daily commute, then it becomes a bit like a car club,
Right.
or a ride pool club where you have a chat on the way to work,
Or they could be like different sized cars, right? So
and that's
it could
the
be
other
like
part.
one person to like bus level sizes.
And it's exactly what we're doing, looking at exactly. Yeah. So the mix is important, but then you need to kind of trade that off against what is viable in terms of the ridership. So it's gonna be harder to fill up a 50-seater bus if it's operating in a completely flexible way.
Yeah, that's true.
Because at the moment, if you think about it, each bus stop essentially has a high potential to reach a small number of destinations, and then that potential diminishes faster as you need to transfer to other services. So you can't access everywhere from every single bus stop. But once you have such a mobility on demand system, where we still see it operating mainly from bus stops, it becomes completely untenable. Well, not untenable, but you really need a very large, very small vehicle fleet in order to serve really building to building demand. So you still only want to keep that to people who really need it. Let's say you're going to do your shopping or whatever, then you want to go really from door to door. But for most part, these things become efficient once you can bundle the rides at transit stops. But then still, each transit stop essentially has the potential to reach any other transit stop. And you're kind of flattening out that accessibility. And then it becomes hard to fill large vehicles because, exactly because everywhere is accessible, not everybody wants to go to exactly the same places you are. So it's going to be hard to find somebody to share that bus with you and make the drop-off along the way. So that's one of the challenges, that we're looking at. And that really becomes a design question.
Yeah.
Because then you might want to look at ways of really funneling, looking at your city and where the demand, is concentrated, and how can you make it really easy for people to reach central points where you can bundle lots of rides and get some efficiency in that system. So it's actually quite a complex and interesting problem.
Right. And is Singapore government collecting all that data where people tap their EasyLink cards? These are like, cards that have monetary value to it, and you tap, and then you tap also when you get out, so that people they can know that what are the distances that people traveled, what was the time, all these. Is that something that the government can use to analyze how people move around in the cities so they can have a better bus system or semi-bus, kind of autonomous bus that can, move efficiently throughout the city? Yeah,
obviously they use that quite. They use that quite efficiently at the moment in terms of their planning, so they have really, really good information on the transportation demand. The big question is really about behavior. It's a bit hard for us to kind of imagine, or measure, or come up with really good estimates of what would be the relative willingness to pay for these services under different circumstances. And so we have to kind of test all sorts of combinations of these things, do what's called sort of a sensitivity analysis to see what what are the different domains, of operation that you can get. Sometimes you'll see that if you set the price relative to other modes of transportation, let's say you set it too low, right? Then all of a sudden, the people might want to have a car come right to their door and drop them off right at their door, and you need a massive fleet of vehicles to serve that kind of demand, and you just end up sitting alone in a car with a bunch of empty robot cars, around you on the highway, right? So you need to really run lots of kind of experiments on the computer before you make your grand plan for how the system is going to operate.
Right.
Yeah.
And how long do you think this will take to actually see fruition, all these experiments and everything? And we could really see these fleets of cars and buses running around.
So I think the capability to plan for it is maturing pretty fast, and obviously the technological capabilities are maturing pretty fast as well. But I would say that the challenge is probably still a technological one.
Okay.
I think we can probably plan for it's easy to imagine the perfect system of robotic cars.
Yeah.
And then you just plan for that, and you design your neighborhoods, and then maybe you reach 2030. That's usually sort of like the planning horizon that a lot of guys are looking at. And you reach that point, and cars are still running over people that are dressed in chicken costumes or things like that, right?
Right.
So that's a typical challenge. The vehicle basically has to make a lot of predictions about human behavior. And unfortunately, that's knowledge that's really hard won, because they need to go out there and farm that information. And that means breaking a few eggs, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's obviously a bit callous, but still, there's a... and we saw what the reaction is, seriously now, that when something bad happens, like what had happened, in the US, with the Uber that ran somebody over.
Yeah.
There's, of course, you could argue that that's a case that would have, any human driver would have been just as susceptible to making an accident, But it's really hard making the statistical case to people. So even if the autonomous vehicles have an accident rate that is an order of magnitude lower than that what human beings are making at the moment, it's still going to be a hard sell.
Yeah.
Because it's a machine that you don't have any real connection to.
Right.
People have that sense of control, even though most drivers are far worse than what they think they are.
Yeah.
When they get on the road.
Yeah.
So
I could like think of examples where a car is running and a little girl and an old lady both come at the same time, and how is that car going to decide which? Because if it's going to go right, it's going to kill the old lady. It's going to go left, it's going to kill the young girl. How is it going to decide?
That taps into exactly those ethical questions. Yeah. That taps into how we actually value human life.
Yeah.
There are actually curves that show you that our value of a human life sort of peaks around 25.
Okay.
And then it sharply gets discounted. So at the beginning it's relatively low, and then the moment that the person is viable, then obviously it picks up very sharply.
Yeah.
Right? And then it sort of peaks around 18 to 25.
Right.
Because the usual thing is then, he had his whole life ahead of him.
Right.
Or her. And then it drops off sharply. And that means that the robot car needs to have some sense of, the human condition and how we make these very subjective and questionable judgments as well.
I mean, it's not that the machines are deciding. I mean, it's the programs that people are going to put into these machines, right? To make that judgment. Are you going to kill the old lady? Are you going to kill the young girl?
If it was only that transparent, right? Sometimes it's also, once these neural networks become complicated enough, it's kind of hard to really disentangle every decision from whatever state that actually led to that. So it becomes a bit of it can be a bit of a black box as well, in that respect. Yeah. So I think that's kind of like maybe we're going to sort of see a sort of Zeno's paradox. Excuse me. Where we simply can't make it good enough until we can't produce an absolute zero accident rate, and maybe then people will just kick back against it and say no, it's not good enough. I mean, look at other self-driving vehicle accidents, like the two massive accidents of the Boeings, the 737s. It's obviously not a trivial thing, to let automation in. So I think that's going to be our ultimate limit. I think that if you had to make an extrapolation of the current state of technology, and you had to sort of just say, well, if we reach, probability of an accident that's 10% of the current rate of accidents, then sure, 10 years from now, I can totally see it happening. But I don't think that's going to be enough. I think they're going to have to far outperform human drivers in every possible way. And maybe we'll have to make some adjustment also of our expectations in terms of the speeds at which these things operate. Maybe it's not going to be like Gattaca, where they just zoom past. Maybe it's going to be a bit more like your vacuum robot, right?
The Roomba.
Exactly.
And in terms of how people will move as well, I mean, you said it's not going to be like WALL-E where we are on these kind of floating chairs and nobody walks anymore. So, if we're not taking these cars, what are we going to be doing, on the roads? Do you think we're just going to be riding scooters all the time? I mean, that's kind of similar to the little seat, right? I mean, and then, you're going to have all these sensors around the city tracking where you're going, and then trying to divert you in certain directions so that maybe there wouldn't be too much congestion in a pedestrian street or something. How is that going to look like?
You've obviously given it more thought than I have. Because actually, that's one of the challenges that's been put to us, by the Urban Redevelopment Authority. They see an increase in the number of deliveries made on these scooters. And that's exactly the kind of question that they're interested in, is how can we kind of keep the all of these deliveries and the pedestrian traffic separately, separated, and that's actually a very good idea. If you can, the big problem is exactly knowing where people are. So we would have to. Currently, our approach would be to design the neighborhood in such a way that it kind of just self-organizes without the need for sensors. So, obviously, there's signage and that sort of thing, but people will still do whatever they want to do. Singapore is always good, also quick to pull out the whip and, sort of put in a fine or whatever if people are
speeding
or they not pushing their scooter across the pedestrian bridge or things like that. So those are ways. But if you one approach, if you wanted to do this in a self-organizing way, was maybe if you make the walkway really tedious for a scooter. Let's say, there's lots of ways of doing that. No? You just put in enough bumps until the guy's teeth are chattering so much that he's going to just preferentially route himself onto, let's say, a side street or something. Yeah. That's one way of doing it. You can make it more circuitous for the motorized vehicle on the pedestrian walkway. So put lots of barriers and things in its way. But then obviously also provide the alternative. No, it's no use. You just giving him a hard time, but not providing an alternative. So that's one way of doing it. But certainly another way would, to impose some sort of technical solution. But to get back to your earlier question about how does active mobility, feed into it? How do we prevent the sort of WALL-E situation where you just constantly? Well, firstly, there are two kind of dystopias there. So one is the WALL-E situation where you just never walk. Yeah. And you just get picked up at your front door, or even get wheeled out on your on something like you've seen like these visions of Honda and Toyota where you almost in like it's almost like a wheelchair, no? That you sat on, and this kind of takes you inside the house everywhere, and sort of pod like slots you in, and then so that's the Wally situation.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's obviously easy ways of preventing that. Is you just don't allow it.
Yeah, don't build it.
But that's the one dystopia. The other dystopia is one where we have something that's like a zero marginal cost for mobility. And basically all that means is that you reach a point where these things become so cheap, because you don't have to pay a driver. That's the biggest. That's the biggest thing that you have to pay for actually when you get into a taxi, right? And this is still in an age where we're paying for the fuel. Yeah. So if let's say you're generating an excess of energy, you've got electric vehicles. There's no real impact in terms of the pollution and things that you're generating, and it's really really cheap to use it. Then you get something where basically you can just spend your whole day, in a vehicle if you're so inclined, right?
Yeah. And just walk for fun.
And that's something kind of scary, and that we have to watch out for. And people think that you're being silly when you propose that, but I can easily imagine a situation where a new mall opens, and they just offer to pay for you to go there, right? They offer to pay for your ride because it is already so cheap.
Right.
It's not that hard to imagine. So that's one of the things that we're going to have to watch out for. How I see us avoiding the first one outside of the regulation is really through design. So we have a really cool urban designer working with us. Her name is Tanvi Maheshwari, and she's been working with us where we kind of come up with an approach where she produces an urban design, like a proposal for a neighborhood. And so it says, and it's really detailed, like you've got your buildings in there, sort of how many people will be living in this building and what sort of things they can do in all the different buildings in the neighborhood. And then there's the road network, and there's like the public transport stops, and really down to the detail of exactly how big is it, what sort of vehicles can fit in there, and what mix of vehicles can it accommodate. And she passes that along to us, and we then run something that's called an agent-based transport simulation.
Okay.
And this is the closest kind of thing that we can get to running an experiment in real life, which would obviously, at the moment we simply don't have those kinds of systems in operation, right? So we we make some estimations about what are the physics of this future system. So how many cars can you pack into a road? How will they operate? And all sorts of assumptions about how they will be operating in terms of the services that they would offer to the consumer. And then we can evaluate that design. So we produce a bunch of synthetic individuals or agents, and they then have to do things all over, in that neighborhood and leave the neighborhood as well, obviously, to go other places. And we then see how the transport system that we propose operates within that design. And then we see, we get a lot of congestion here, or we see that there's a queue of vehicles building up, like the queues of taxis that you see on the way to the airport.
Yeah.
And then we can say, okay, well, what can we do here? Maybe we should move this bus stop, a bit closer to the building or further away, or put in an extra stop. We look at things like how far do people actually walk, because the agents have been tuned to behave at least in a similar way to how we behave currently with the sort of options that are open to us.
Right.
And we're refining that even more and more. So, like right now, if you had to walk 500 meters to reach a bus stop, you might do that. But if you had to walk 500 meters and cross an overpass bridge,
Yeah.
then you're going to think twice because you're going to climb all those stairs. In fact, we found through some my colleagues, Michael van Egermond and Alex Erath, they found through some of their earlier studies that people are willing to walk as much as 4 or 5 minutes, I think,
you're gonna be
to avoid that.
Right.
To avoid that sort of thing.
Oh, okay.
So we put all of that into the design then as well. So we, she will create a detailed pedestrian network, and we say, okay, well, this is a covered walkway or this is not, because in Singapore that matters a lot. The sun is really bright and it can rain and whatever.
Yeah.
And we know from experiments how people, what kind of things they prefer. So you want to rather walk down a street with lots of shops and things and maybe some greenery rather than walk by the side of a highway, right? You'll see that the kind of perceived walking time for the same distance increases dramatically the more unpleasant it becomes. So it feels like you're walking a lot further. Or if you have to now climb this thing and climb down on the other side, it will feel a lot worse for the agents that we have in there that are like these synthetic people.
Right.
So you can then play around with the design and you can start adjusting it and really immediately see what's the feedback in terms of how well the transport system performs, and you can see what are the sort of configurations that you need in order to sort of hit those targets that you want in terms of the the positive activities that the agents perform. So that's a very long-winded answer, but that's kind of where we're going with that.
Right. And then in these, I mean, human activities are not really static, right? I mean, they evolve through time, and then even if there was a building that housed a retail shop of no particular popularity amongst people, and all of a sudden there's a Starbucks, and all of a sudden people started to move in that direction. I mean, how do cities like actually capture all that and then redesign the whole transportation system or kind of things so that you could divert all that or something, like it's always we're always changing, right? There's no, just because the past 5 years people were walking like this or using transportation and in a manner doesn't mean it's going to be the same in 5 years time, right? Because things change.
Yeah, so there are a couple of answers to that. I would say that, I mean, the first instrument of control, and especially in Singapore where things are really well planned, is your master plan. Excuse me. Singapore is quite unique in the sense that they, it's one government that's been in power for how many years now?
Since the 60s, I guess.
Yeah, right. So it's and that means that they remain. You can't just walk away and it's somebody else's problem. Whoever is going to take over from you next, right? So there's a high degree of being accountable for the plans that you make. So in that sense, it's a lot different from a lot of the world. In that sense, they really have to plan for that sort of for exactly those sort of futures that might unfold, like you say. And the main instrument that they have for that is something that they call the master plan. So where they make very careful decisions about what sorts of development are allowed where over time, and there's a whole bureaucratic process with if you want to change the prospective use of a parcel of land, and there's a whole process that you have to go through before that can happen. And then at least it means that you can change your plans, or you can evaluate your plans that you have and see is that change viable, or is it going to introduce is it going to make a mess of everything? So that's the one way to do it. The other way is through like the thing that I mentioned before, sensitivity analysis, where you run a bunch of scenarios and you say, what if I'm wrong? Let's say this is going to be, let's say exactly like you say, I don't anticipate the building of the Starbucks and this neighborhood taking off for whatever reason. Yeah. But you can run these experiments on the computer and see how the neighborhood will perform under a number of different circumstances. and then you can again, begin to anticipate it
Right.
and say that, okay, well, if this happens, then I should do this, this, and this to deal with that situation.
And currently, like human beings are doing this, but like in the future, would machines be doing all the
Actually, to a large extent, AI is already starting to do a lot
Okay.
of this. Yeah.
Right.
So there's in fact, at this urban urban sustainability R&D congress that they'd had a couple of days ago here in Singapore, there was a whole session on the science of cities and how more and more agencies are becoming reliant on AI to inform their planning process, to kind of pick up on the signals that we aren't capable of, simply because the system is so complex.
Yeah.
So that's definitely happening, and obviously we're just getting more and more data across so many more domains. As it's becoming easier to kind of join these data sets together, you can start to make sense across a lot of it, and will hopefully pick up on those signals before things get out of hand. Yeah.
Right. I see. And then are we trying to build or create more data to feed into this AI so that it can, kind of turn more, useful, ideas for us to use in this smart city, concept, because, that means like there's going to be like more sensors everywhere. People are going to be tracked, and, it seems like there's going to be so much, technology all over the city that are, trying to make data out of everything. That it almost seems like it's going to be like an overflow of data, just because you want to keep like feeding data into this AI so that it'll turn out something interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's a possibility that you might be seeing things that simply aren't there simply because it's an overflow of information.
Yeah.
But I kind of I've got a I think that we maybe really don't understand AI in a sense. It's not like us where we reach a certain point of information overflow. More information usually in these machine learning models is always better. So they usually perform better at predicting the more information you throw at them.
Yeah, exactly.
It's kind of an information theoretic thing. I mean, I'm speaking under correction there because I'm not a computer scientist, but I do use these things a fair bit. And that's generally what we find is if the model doesn't predict well, then usually if you add in more information from another source, then suddenly the prediction improves because now there's something that kind of can explain what you're seeing happening. What I see as I think it's more a question of access, really, of how do you manage to connect all of these things up to and make it equitably accessible. I think that's kind of going to be more of a challenge rather than so much a question of an information overload. And then of course privacy, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's the biggest thing. And I mean, we haven't even talked about blockchain yet, but that's kind of where I see a lot of potential. The fact that we can use that kind of technology to have more control over what kind of information gets released to whom, and what level of access are we willing to give to different people, and even to things like getting to topics like the monetization of my own data, the things that I'm generating. There's a lot of stuff happening, from what I could see in the blockchain space.
What we don't want to see is government owning all that data just because they run the city and then selling it off to private corporations for making more tax revenues or something, right?
I've heard some interesting perspectives on this idea of, especially in this day and age of artificial intelligence. And I mean, this is an aside, but listening to Sam Harris's podcast on the topic of things like Facebook and so on, and firms that actively kind of mine your data.
Yeah.
The perspective that this author had given was that you're not the product, which is usually the case when you're not paying for a service. You're really the fuel.
Yeah.
Right? So in the sense that this thing is learning from you in order to replace you,
Right.
ultimately. It's kind of scary, right? So I hope that there are these ways of not just monetizing the data that we generate, that these things will get trained on in the end, but even licensing models that you can have some sort of persistent ownership, especially once you get replaced by them, that you can somehow share in the profits,
Right.
that they're going to be generating. But yeah, that's neither here nor there.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you were saying that before we started this conversation that, we can use blockchain and cryptocurrency for payments when we were on these, automated cars or even, MRTs, subways that we're using in Singapore or anywhere in the world that we start building smart cities. I mean, how does that kind of, collide?
Yeah, so that's that kind of feeds into this rather hyped up concept of mobility as a service. Really, all that means is that you have a good idea of where everything that you ride on sits in the city. So there's 500 horses here and 200 scooters there, and there's a shared car there. And you hopefully don't own all of that stuff yourself. So there's some sort of way of paying people and navigating the complexities of different payment systems. Typically, what is proposed, like for instance, I'm actually involved in a kind of a foundation that's advocating for ways of rethinking the mobility system. It's called Travel Spirit. So I hopefully will be ramping up some activities in ASEAN for this foundation and really get people to start talking about this a bit more. But typically, what you can do is to just start a new platform, right? Where small players can hook up into. There are other concepts out there very similar, also blockchain enabled, like IOMob, for instance, in the US. And the idea is that you rather than trying to deal with every possible payment system, you just get people to sign up onto this platform, and whether you're Uber or Grab or whatever, a new mobility company, you say, okay, to the user, okay, you want to go from year to year, these are your options. You can jump on a horse and ride it to the MRT, and then you can get off and get into a robot car on the other end. And each one of these things is going to belong to a different authority, and you have this homogeneous payment system where whatever your token is on the blockchain system. And it also becomes a means of enforcement to prevent bad actors from saying that they're going to serve the ride and not doing it in the end. Obviously, the idea being also that once things become autonomous, then the number of bad actors will decrease. But that's really what it comes down to. Mobility as a service is being able to connect everything up. And that idea is also that as the amount of sensing in the city increases, we'll have a much better idea of where everything sits. Because how frustrating it is when you had these bicycle sharing services, and it tells you there's a bicycle there, and then you get there and there's nothing. The thing is lying in a ditch or something.
Yeah, right.
So I think that's kind of what we're seeing through sensing and so on, ubiquitous computing and so on. We'll have a good sense of where everything is and kind of what the state of that thing is as well, in order to deliver these kinds of solutions.
In a bit like Grab, that's kind of pretty dominant in Singapore and Southeast Asia. They have a payment system already where you can pay. Well, they even they did buy a bicycle sharing company, which flopped anyway. But you with their Grab Pay, you were able to pay for your car rides, your bicycle, any food deliveries, and all these other things. I can even send you money. Like you don't really need.
You don't need a blockchain
yeah,
necessarily to make
exactly.
that happen. Yeah, totally. And I'm sure that those kind of companies will argue that why do you need this sort of thing?
Yeah.
Of course, the idea is that you having such an ecosystem would open up everybody's data to everybody else. I think that's kind of also the idea behind Travel Spirit. That's the idea behind guys like IOMob as well. That the blockchain, besides being a payment system, is also a ledger, right? It's a database. It's a shared database that allows everybody to see what's going on everywhere. Yeah. So it would allow smaller players to, for instance, offer their ride or have, be subcontracted by bigger players in the same system because they can see, what's happening everywhere. There will be information about the willingness to pay. Being shared across the entire platform. So those are the upshots. But it is a hard sell, exactly. Because of course, if you're already a big player, why would you want to get onto this sort of thing? Yeah. Even if we can demonstrate that it's going to benefit everybody in the end, if there is more data sharing across such a platform, and obviously responsible data sharing, across such platforms.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, after all this Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and stuff, I mean, I think more and more people should demand that their data is stored in blockchain, that it's encrypted and it's all pseudo anonymous, rather than having all your personal data out there. Yeah. And obviously for me, like personally, like, Facebook's Libra is also kind of something that, scares the shit out of me. But, this is for completely another topic. Just going back to, okay, so then we talked about cars. What about like intercontinental travel? I mean, is that something that you guys think about or because, like, airplanes haven't really innovated that much aside from the software that they use and then how they design the airplane, but the speed of airplanes haven't really changed that much, right? I mean, is there even a way that we can go from Singapore to LA in like 4 hours instead of 16? Is there something that you guys think about?
I would say that we're a bit more sort of concerned with the urban condition, although in previous in previous projects, we had looked at development around these aviation hubs, and how the city connects up to other cities and how these things are interrelated. But yeah, in terms of aviation, we're not currently doing that much work. Certainly, I just know that it's. The biggest concern is obviously still the impact, the greenhouse gas impact of that mode of transportation. And it's interesting to listen to like ads by KLM where they kind of actively discourage you to use them as a service. Right. They say, do you really need to travel? Do you really need to be at that meeting in person? Right. So it was kind of jarring to hear a company kind of actively discouraging you to use them, but maybe we'll start to see a bit more of that. It's
yeah, definitely. More and more, I think everybody's working styles are changing as well. Gig economy, we talk about that quite a lot, but everybody's kind of don't need to go to an office anymore. Everybody's like working individually, and it seems like that's the way people are going. Although they're saying that the urban population is going to grow much bigger, so I don't know how that fits into that.
I've heard even of a concept of in some Scandinavian countries of flight shaming, they call it.
Flight shaming.
Yeah.
Oh.
So if you travel unnecessarily,
Yeah.
then your people will kind of look down on you, which is kind of an interesting.
It's a nice culture to have.
Right?
I guess part of it is like instilling, right cultures into place where, it's not like fat shaming, but like, flight shaming, using, dirty fuel, or even with energy, why aren't you choosing, renewable energy over, burning coal, that kind of, shaming needs to probably be instilled before we can really get this smart city thing going.
Yeah, I mean, I think, certainly cultures will have to change, and shaming is a very effective way of doing that, right? But also maybe pride in choosing something that's more sustainable.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, we can see signs of that. I would say the younger generation is probably a bit more attuned to their impact on their environment.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll see a bit more of that happening. But like you say, there are also from one geographical region to the next, the cultures might be radically different. So to somehow propagate this across different cultures is going to be
right.
It's going to be a challenge.
Yeah.
Some exciting stuff that's happening, at least in terms of sea transport. I've recently heard about there's a push to go back to wind-powered sea transport.
Really?
Yeah. So that seems, although we haven't done any work on that, I at least find that sort of an exciting
I guess
concept.
you could use the wind, not like a sail, right? I mean, you use wind power to like fuel the speed of the cars, or are you?
No, they're using the wind directly, but it's through using the Magnus effect. So it's this really weird, I think it's called Flettner is the guy who built the Flettner rotor. I was telling one of my colleagues about this the other day because it was on a podcast, where you have this massive spinning rotor.
Mm-hmm.
And just like the spin in a golf ball, there's if there's a wind blowing across it, it actually causes lift, like on the lift on an airplane.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's a really weird thing to see. You see this ship with this massive cylinder,
Right.
And it's moving forward completely soundlessly because it's more efficient than a sail.
Right.
Actually, but obviously they still have engines to back them up when there's no wind.
There's no wind. Yeah.
And the current system, the guy had argued that maybe our current logistics, our expectations is to have stuff within 2 days. So again, it comes back to culture change.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we shouldn't have it in 2 days. Maybe we should wait a couple of days and get used to that. Get used to maybe a slower, get back to a slower life like we've been living maybe 60 years ago.
Well, I guess people on cruises nowadays, they don't really care about getting to one place quickly, right? They just want to enjoy the ride rather than the actual destination itself.
Exactly. There's a famous TED talk by Rory Sutherland. I knew I was going to stumble over that with the R's. This advertising guy who said that rather than build high-speed rails, if him as an advertising guy, what he would suggest is take a slow train and just have, supermodels serve the drinks, and people will ask that they slow down even more, right? So
I'll definitely get on that.
So there's loads of behavioral changes that we can induce just by kind of rethinking it from a social perspective. I see.
Interesting. And for you, Peter, I mean, you grew up in Johannesburg, and how did you really get into this space? What was your journey?
So I actually grew up in a small town next to Mozambique. Next to the Kruger National Park, and then the typical thing is you get out of the small towns and go to the city the moment you can leave the house. And that's how I came to Pretoria, Johannesburg, and I had a bit of a detour in life. I worked in television production for a while there, but then ultimately became interested in, after reading some books about complexity science and about really how they're starting to use the tools of physics in the domain of social sciences. I really found that kind of fascinating, and then I'd gone back to to do a master's degree in industrial engineering, which also deals with creating models and representations of the world. And we got stuck on solving some of the logistics problems that we had in South Africa. South Africa, all of the deliveries have to be made during the day. So the roads are constantly congested with huge trucks.
Right.
And especially in Johannesburg, there are one or two famous hills, where the trucks just don't give a damn, so they take up all three lanes, trying to overtake each other on an uphill, and then that just causes massive congestion throughout the entire system. So my professor at that stage, Johan Joubert, he wanted to solve this problem, and said, why don't we just do deliveries at night? And they said, well, we don't have a public transportation system in South Africa. We only have these minibus taxis, and they stop operating at 10 o'clock at night.
Right.
And so he said, okay, let's just fix the transportation system then. So that was his approach. And that's how we got stuck in with looking at transportation. And then it became apparent that the system in South Africa is so complicated because of this minibus system that there weren't any models at that stage that you can really use in the planning perspective to make sort of strategic decisions about how to move forward. And that's how we met up with the developers of this Asian-based technology that we're using. A professor called Kai Nagel from Technical University of Berlin, and then Kai Axhausen, who also turned out to be my thesis supervisor for my PhD in the end. That's a long, long story.
And you did your PhD at the ETH Zurich?
I did it actually right here in Singapore at the Future Cities Laboratory, which is a resource center of ETH Zurich.
And this project with the ETH Zurich Future Cities, is this a collaboration with the government, or is it with the university? How long is this gonna keep going?
So it's we're established by the National Research Foundation, so the Office of the Presidency is, and they're the ones paying the bill. And the concept was really to bring a bunch of the world's best universities together in one place.
Right.
So if you go to then just across the highway from the National University of Singapore, there's a campus where you'll find TU Munich, you'll find MIT, you'll find us, you'll find UC Berkeley, you'll find Yale.
Right.
All of them stuck together. So it's a bit of I think it was probably a bit jarring for a lot of the colleagues at the university to suddenly have so much competition right across the road. But I think over time we've formed really good relationships and a lot of complementary research. And that's now, for instance, how we're involved in some research projects with the National University of Singapore as one of the partners. So we've kind of integrated quite well.
And all these people from different universities are all collaborating together in this Future Cities
Increasingly so, yeah. So Future Cities Laboratory is one of the programs. When you have the Smart Future Mobility Program, and the NRF regularly introduces grant calls to really foster interinstitutional collaboration within that campus and more across Singapore. So typically nowadays the projects that we launch are really problem-focused projects, and it involves a lot of disciplines, a lot of different educational institutions as well as agencies. So, like I said, for instance, for this this autonomous vehicle urban design project, it's 1, 2, 3 universities and then 5 government agencies.
Wow!
Altogether, working on it.
So, what are the other projects that you're working on at the moment?
So we're a small group, but we actually have 4 projects that we're working on concurrently. So we have two projects in active mobility, and there it's really my two colleagues that are currently based in Zurich, Michael van Egermond and Professor Alex Erat. They launched these projects, and we have a local PhD, a guy called Mohsen Nazemi, who's working on a cycling simulator. That's quite fun. It's using virtual reality and obviously a physical bicycle. You get in there and you cycle along the typical Singaporean road.
Yeah.
And sometimes you're on the road, sometimes you're on dedicated cycling infrastructure, sometimes you're dodging pedestrians. And he puts a sensor on you, and he measures your rate of kind of excitation.
Really?
And,
Wow.
I'm sure there's a more proper word for it.
So is he like on a spin cycle and with like these goggles on?
Yeah, you get the goggles on, and then you start cycling, and it's got sensors to pick up when things are actually moving and when you're braking, and the galvanic sensor, or the thing that measures your skin conductance and other things like your heart rate and whatever. It's constantly monitoring you as you cycle through this environment, and obviously because you're using VR, it can pick up on when you're turning your head to pick up if you're looking at stuff. So you're cycling, and then it's got sound as well, so you can hear the bus approaching, and you can see people get kind of a little bit jittery.
Right.
We had some problems with people almost falling off the bike because they're trying to get out of the way. So they've really constrained the experiment now in a way that make people at least feel safe enough. In this virtual environment, and you can see how people respond if there's a like a left turn coming up. You can see their awareness increasing. So, and that's obviously very useful in terms of planning what kind of infrastructure to build. Where a large part of that was really just figuring out if this stuffing, if this thing is giving you something that you can really interpret as kind of being representative of real behavior. So he's done a fair bit of work on that.
So is this like trying to map out or redesign the city so that the cycling experience is better, or like what is this for?
Yeah, so that's obviously one of the goals. Right? Singapore is investing quite a bit in their cycling infrastructure.
Okay.
And but it's expensive and space is limited. So you usually can't just say one size fits all. You have to know what are the trade-offs that you're making. When you're building one kind of thing here and another thing there. And this kind of tool is quite useful because you can produce a pretty plausible realization of an existing neighborhood and see how people react, and more specifically how different user groups react, because that's obviously important as well. You might be more willing to cycle, on the road if you were cycling by yourself rather than when you had your daughter sitting on the back of the bicycle. Right?
Right.
So all of those things they take into consideration as well.
Right.
And then the other research is obviously there's the autonomous vehicle, project. The other active mobility project is really Michael van Egermond again and Alex. They are looking at pedestrian comfort in high pedestrian activity areas. So they have a number of sites, and this is again a project that they're doing for the agencies, where they look at really high pedestrian activity areas, and they really counted the number of people walking across every possible walkway in places like Orchard and in Jurong East, and then get a sense of what kind of design interventions can you make to make the experience better for people who are actually walking there, and also maybe kind of distribute the load in plausible ways. That project's still ongoing, and then besides the autonomous vehicle project, we also have quite a fair bit of work going on in the field of data privacy, specifically mobility data privacy. And there it's really my colleagues Sergio Ordóñez, who's also working on the autonomous vehicle thing, and Temo Anda, a Mexican guy who's a PhD with us, and they're working with Singtel DataSpark,
Okay.
which is DataSpark is the geoanalytics arm of Singtel, and they're looking at cell phone data and how can we use it in a kind of a way that we can absolutely guarantee the privacy of the people that are generating that data, but still get useful things out of it. And what we're doing there, for instance, is Temo builds a thing that he calls his traveler generator machine. And really what this is it's an algorithm that uses just general statistics of generated by all of these users, in the cellular phone system.
Yeah.
So when I say statistics, it's things like from 12 o'clock until 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 20,000 people travel from Orchard to Badok, for instance, right? But other things are more interesting statistics. For instance, it says that if you find yourself in Badok at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, then you are, let's say, 60% likely to go somewhere that you haven't been before, or you are 40% likely to return to a location that you'd visited before. That sounds like a really weird thing to put out, but again, because we're just dealing with a large, with a number there rather than with an individual.
Yeah.
If you have these kinds of statistics, it becomes possible for you to create synthetic individuals,
Right.
that have travel patterns that look a lot like the patterns that we have in the actual system. So you can create any number of synthetic travelers using these kind of statistics, and they will move in a way that's kind of like how the real population moves. So if you had to kind of count together all the kilometers that they drive during the day, you'll see that, it looks a bit like how Singaporeans travel.
Right. I see.
In fact, a fair bit, to the extent, within only a few percentage points. And that means that you have a really, really good substitute for the actual data. That that's the real privacy concern.
Right.
So you can use this synthetic stream of data, and it means you can share it between agencies completely safely, not have to worry, that you're compromising any person's,
Identity.
Anything like that. So that's incredibly useful, as a way to plan for transport, using the sensing capabilities that we have, but not compromising privacy in any way, shape, or form.
Right. But these Singtel actually knows all their customers where they're moving around in the city.
They actually go to extreme measures to try and limit their knowledge.
Okay.
So, for instance, when Temo goes in to work on this stuff, he really goes into a white room where that's kind of sealed off and air gapped. There's no way that you can leave with any of that data. And the systems are designed to scramble people's personal information. So they go to great lengths already within the organization to wall this off completely and to really, really limit access. And their greatest concern, obviously, is how can they give absolute guarantees to their client base that that they're not compromising their privacy in any way, shape, or form. So they really try their best. There's only a very limited number of people that have access to that data, and that access is very, very carefully monitored.
Oh, wow. Okay. Interesting.
So no, I think they go to great lengths, and obviously, for cellular providers like that, they need to, if you think about the prohibitive costs of, especially once we're going into things like 4G, right? We think, okay, 4G is just another G.
Right.
It's a hell of a deal, actually. I spoke to a very interesting Korean researcher the other day, and unfortunately his name now escapes me. But he said that Moore's law doesn't apply to cellular infrastructure.
Okay.
Because it's not just digital; it's also analog. The transmitters, are analog. So the digital signal still needs to get translated into something analog.
Right.
And the 4G technology simply, in order to produce those levels of bandwidth, just needs a lot more of that analog technology packed in there.
Right.
And that technology doesn't scale with Moore's law.
Right.
It's pretty stable. So the costs are incredibly high, and you as a user won't be willing, to pay that cost. You want that level of connectivity, but you're not going to be willing to now suddenly pay twice as much for your cellular bill. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Somebody needs to pay for that.
Yeah.
So one should understand that that there is a desperate need in order to provide the level of service that we want. The companies need to make money in more than one way,
right?
Than just charging it to the end user.
Yeah.
But they are at least responsible enough to say that that this doesn't mean that we now just throw out our users' privacy.
Yeah.
How can we develop products that we can then that can be used in all sorts of useful ways that ultimately produces this sort of smart city that we all want, but not compromise their privacy.
Right.
And so they're obviously they're keen to see these kinds of approaches, that we're looking at, that allows them to monetize that data completely safely, and to be able to then introduce these future technologies without pushing the cost down to the end user.
Right. Yeah, with the 5G coming along, then.
Sorry, 4G. I said it should be 5G. Jeez, I'm revealing my age here. Right? I'm still stuck on 4G.
Yeah. So 5G.
Exactly. The 5G is the thing that's going to be so expensive. Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
That's so they're just going to have to pack so many more of those transmitters in there at cost, and we're not going to be willing to pay that cost.
Right. And how do these companies actually kind of make our identity pseudonymous? I mean, obviously they want some data, right? They want to know that I'm male, my age, somewhat, of my racial profile, whatever it is. I mean, there is some data that they actually need. Is it just a name that's kind of like?
So that's exactly the sort of old approach to this issue, was to just kind of give a randomized ID, but then you could still follow the guy around, and then if I saw that this guy goes from Queenstown to, let's say, to this area, and then from there to there, and it does this on a regular basis, then I can very quickly identify you, because there's only a number of people that would make those combination of trips, right? But that's exactly what they're trying to avoid.
Right.
So there's no individual data that they actually release. And they, exactly with these kinds of approaches, what we're trying to do is come up with ways that you can produce let's say, I would say mid-30s sort of dude with a certain, high income bracket. And he's going to be traveling around, but he's not going to go exactly where you're going. He's not going to live where you exactly live. But if you have enough of these synthetic guys moving around, then you're going to see the levels of congestion that you see in Singapore. You're going to see approximately the same patterns of footfall by different demographic types in different parts of the city. So simply because the statistics pan out. If there's enough of something happening, then it's really what really starts to matter more is the larger patterns that emerge. Of course, it's a completely separate question when you come to really location-based services where real-time information is important. The stuff that we're working on with them is more around ways that you can publish data after the fact in a safe way. But when it comes to real-time location and things like that, then it's more an issue of, the frameworks that are put in place in terms of the smart devices.
Yeah.
And you can see, that the companies, they ask you a list of questions. Are you willing to give this, or this, or this?
Yeah.
And you know, obviously to a large extent, it's also about the trust relationship that exists between you and that service provider.
Yeah.
About what level of access they really give away.
Yeah. I mean, this real location thing is like, I was thinking, in my limited knowledge, there's going to be like cameras everywhere and they're going to do facial recognition so they know who you are, your age and all these things, and then going to track you everywhere. That was kind of the level I was thinking about
that can definitely still happen.
Yeah, right.
And there, I mean, then it becomes a question of the extent to which you trust the really, I guess, the government and institutions, or unless these devices are owned by private companies, that it becomes more of a legislative issue about. And we know that those things are relatively slower to catch up with what people really want, right? I mean, what's it called, the GDPR?
GDPR, yeah.
It's how many years has it been, and it's only now that this sort of thing is really starting to kick in. So certainly, I think it's a valid concern that maybe it's not just your own device, but all of the other devices that you have to be concerned about. And we only find out after the fact that this agency has actually been using facial recognition for so long, to do different kind of things.
Yeah. I remember like Facebook had this. I don't know if it still has it because I don't use it anymore. But once I go to a certain location, it will tell me where my friends are if they're like 5 kilometers within radius or something like that. I remember there was some kind of
amazingly allowed that stuff to happen. Right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean that's kind of like that technology is already here, right? So imagine like where I can imagine where 10, 20 years from now. A super hyper version of that is happening across all, kind of companies or data that are spread around different companies, knowing that where you are, what you're doing, and then they want to sell you something or.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it depends a lot on the company culture. I think, for instance, like the guys that we're working with, they are actively working towards, privacy and guarantees of privacy. And I mean, there are other big tech companies like Apple is also one of the, probably one of the better players. And but then Google argues that privacy is, is a luxury item, right? So I think it's still a very, very tough problem. And I think once we start talking about just anybody putting up a sensor somewhere. I certainly don't see that happening in Singapore, that you can just go around and sticking up, cameras everywhere you want to. But maybe this is a good test bed to see how, you can systematically deal with that sort of thing. But yeah, it could be quite scary actually.
Yeah.
If we think about it, if every single thing out there, has a camera, and maybe if even, in a more dystopian vision, just because it has a camera doesn't mean it has the processing capability, but, to do the recognizing. But of course, it's just information, so it would just get transmitted to somewhere where that processing capability, actually exists, right? So
I mean, it's a double-edged sword, right? If you suddenly have a sickness and you're on the street and you fall down, and because of the cameras are actually watching you, maybe an emergency ambulance, flying object flies and helps.
That could
you,
be
right?
the positive.
Yeah,
certainly. Yeah. But of course, a dystopian vision of it would be that you're walking down the street and you maybe you show a facial tick or something, and then your medical insurance gets alerted that this guy looks like a good candidate for Parkinson's.
Right.
So there's all sorts of very nasty stuff.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, you could lie on your insurance policy and say you don't smoke, but you actually caught smoking, on camera, right?
Scary, Really, we'll all be behaving like class captains in the end. Even if, maybe you don't even need a regime to do that. Maybe a capitalist system is already enough to.
Yeah, it's already happening. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Well, that's great. Thanks. You've left him with a far more dystopian vision, I can imagine. I guess at some point we'll just simply have to rely on the various authorities, out there to somehow act in our interest.
Yeah. Cool.
That's a great note to end on.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time. I enjoyed it a lot.
All right.
Thank you very much, man.
Good.
Thanks.
Future Design Podcast.